Hello and welcome to Mostly Vintage Cameras. This is a Konica Pop, launched in 1982. It had design revisions in 1985 and 1988 and was available in the Japanese market under the name of C35EFS. It is a very basic camera. It's fixed focus, it's fixed exposure, it's manual mechanical wind on, and there's no DX coding. So really very basic point and shoot type of camera. Somebody that wanted a camera to take pictures of high days and holidays and didn't want to spend a lot of money might have been tempted into this, and we'll talk about the pricing of this later on in the video, because although it is a basic camera, it was actually fairly pricey for what you got for the money. The reason for that, of course, being the build quality of the Pop is legendary. It is a remarkably solid little camera. So let's take a closer look at what we do have. At the front here we can see we've got a 36mm f4 hexagon lens. And we'll have to investigate quite how you access that f4 maximum aperture, because it's not quite as obvious as you might imagine. We also have film speed settings of 100, 200 and 400 ISO, set just with this little slider switch at the bottom here. And that's about it. So let's go ahead and put some batteries in this. Battery compartment's just under here. This particular one has had a corroded battery at some point in the past, but we should be okay. So it runs on two regular AA batteries, which I'm sure will please many people. Now the camera can work perfectly happily without batteries in ambient light. The batteries are only used by the CDS meter, which doesn't change the exposure, it just gives you a low light warning. And the other thing that uses the batteries, of course, is the pop-up flash unit, and it's the pop-up flash unit that gives the camera its name of Pop, which is quite fun. So let's see, in 85 the hexagon name was dropped from the front of the camera, and hexagon is to Konica what Rokkor is to Minolta or Nikkor to Nikon. It's their premium brand of lenses. I don't know why Konica decided to drop it on this camera, but it may be that they didn't feel that a fixed focus camera really warranted the hexagon name. In 85 also they made the flash circuit recharge a little bit quicker, and they introduced a few new colours, and we'll talk about the colours these cameras come in, because as I'm sure you're probably aware, they did do quite a rainbow of colours. The shutter speed on this, it's one shutter speed. It's 125th of a second, so it's fast enough to offer some sort of freezing of motion and avoid camera shake, but it's slow enough to work in most lighting conditions. So with that one shutter speed of 125th of a second, one of the classic problems you get taking pictures of camera shake is very much eliminated. So what we have are three things coming together to make a really iconic 80s camera. A very basic point and shoot camera, excellent build quality, and the injection of a sense of fun with that range of colours available. Konica did a really good job of capturing people's imagination with this camera, and they went on to sell about 1.5 million of them. It was in production certainly until the early 90s. I remember selling it back at that time. So it was in production for around about 10 years. Now, as we go through this camera, I'd like to have a look at it from the point of view of two users, if you will. Firstly, the sort of person who would have bought this camera originally in 82 onwards, who would have wanted a cheap point and press camera. Sometimes we would joke that it's the sort of person that would have a roll of film developed, there'd be a Christmas tree on each end and one in the middle. So they're not really taking a lot of photographs, they just want memories from high days and holidays, which is absolutely fine and very much what this camera is designed for. And then I'd like to take a look at it from the point of view of somebody who might want to use one of these in the modern time, in the 2020s. and how you might be able to leverage some of the limited features, particularly the ISO setting, to make it a little bit more flexible as a camera. So let's go ahead and put a film in as though we were a consumer. Here's a roll of film. Now Konica was a film manufacturer and they were part of Sakura, so they very much advertise Konica and Sakura Color, but any film will work, any 35mm film. So the instructions will tell you to put the film in the film chamber, pull the leader out, put it into one of these take-up slots, there we go, fire the shutter, wind on, fire the shutter, wind on. That doesn't feel very positive, does it? And you just want to make sure the perforations are engaged in this sprocket. And just to be on the safe side, I'm going to do that one more time. Now when we close the back, you may have noticed the rewind crank popped open. I'm just going to, no I'm not actually, I'm going to pretend that I'm a 1981 original user. And there we are, we're ready to go. All we need to do is check that on the ISO dial we've set this to 200 ISO, or ASO as it probably would have been at that time, and away we go. All we need to do now is take a picture, and we keep taking pictures. There's a little frame counter on the top here, tells us when we get to the end, and away you go. Now that battery I mentioned earlier powers this little CDS meter cell just here by the viewfinder, and if the camera thinks you're going to get underexposure, it turns on this little red light by the viewfinder. So if you get this little red warning light, it's the camera telling you that you might want to use the flash unit, or you probably should use the flash unit, and that's on half pressure of the release button. To turn the flash unit on, just slide the control on the front, wait for the flash ready lamp to pop up or to light up, and away you go. Now the flash unit works about between 2.5 and 3 meters, something like that. It's not a very powerful flash unit. The lens, incidentally, the preset focus is 2.8 meters, so it's very much optimized for the mid distance, a sort of two people or a small group, and it gets progressively softer nearer the camera and further away from that distance. But as you can see, it is marked 1.5 to 2 meters with a little arrow indicating you should push this in, and if you push this in, it stops the lens down a little bit more. So if you're using the flash close to your subject, there is a stop down to prevent overexposure or to reduce overexposure. And that's basically how you go about taking your photographs. At the end of the film, all you need to do is rewind it. Film loading and rewind on this, given the target audience for the camera, is, I'll be honest, a little bit fiddly. And that is a shame. So you can hear the film rewinding, grinding away in there. Oops. And then we pop the camera open and take that off to the photo finisher to get processed. So that's how it was intended to be used. Now let's look at that process again from a point of view of somebody who might know a little bit more about photography and wants to try, or return to even perhaps analog photography with a simple point and press camera. Now what we need to know is when we change the film speed, we're actually changing the aperture. So at let's start with 100 ASA. At 100 ASA, our aperture is f8. At 200 ASA, our aperture is f11. And at 400 ASA, our aperture is f16. So you can think of this as an ISO dial, but also as an aperture setting. The other way to think of this, and the way that I tend to think of it when I'm using it, is sunny, hazy sun, cloudy. Now, the eagle-eyed or eagle-eared among you would have spotted that the 100 ISO was only f8 and the lens has a maximum aperture of f4. Well, remember that pop-up flash? When you turn the flash unit on, it opens the aperture up initially. So if it's f8 at 100 ISO, it's f4 with the flash unit popped up, and it drops down to f8 again if you use the close flash feature. So to go through the apertures again, I've got at 100 ISO f8, f4, and then at 200 I've got f11 and f5.6, and then at 400 I've got f16 and f8. So I've got quite a range of apertures there, 5 apertures to choose from when I'm taking my photographs. So that's a handy thing to know if you've got a good understanding of exposure and you want to basically fiddle your exposure as you're taking the pictures. So let's go ahead and look at film loading, the way I would do it. Obviously open the camera back, that's not optional. But I would take the film leader first, and I would stuff it in one of these slots to make sure it was very securely and positively in there, and then pull the film cassette back. And that means I've used the least amount of film possible to get from the take-up spool to the cassette. I might be able to squeeze an extra frame or two out of here. And it's engaged on the sprockets very nicely. Close the back, one. And what I would also do is just take up the tension in the rewind crank. We don't want to stretch the film or damage it, we just want to take up the tension. And then if we watch this little plate here as we wind on, we can see that moves around. Or at least hopefully you can see that moves around. And that way we know our film is advancing correctly. So that little tip, combined with using the ISO scale either as a sunny, cloudy, overcast option or as an aperture ring, should give us a little bit more flexibility, let's say, in operating the camera. Now, I did run a film through this particular camera, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. And to do that, I'm going to break out the MVC light box. Okay, so these are the negatives that I shot in the Konica Pop. And they're, as you can see, just glancing over them, they are for the most part very evenly exposed. They were taken on a number of days over a period of probably as much as 3 months in actual fact. It took me really rather quite a long time to get through this film. The first thing you might notice is every now and then there are blank frames. Here and so on and so forth. And the reason for that is very simple. I don't know if you're going to be able to see this in this lighting. One moment. Oh, I don't know what that looks like. If you take a picture and wind on, and then put this in your bag or your case or your pocket, it's very easy. There's no shutter lock. It's very easy to trip the shutter by accident. The alternative to that is to not wind on, obviously, between frames. The only problem with that being, when you come to take a picture, oh, I've forgotten to wind on again. And that's almost equally as irritating as having blank frames. Although in fairness it is cheaper than having blank frames. So let's just go through a few of these. As I'm looking at the negatives, these images should pop up on your screen. Let me get the right way round. That's better. So this is Fuji Color 400 film. Color neg film, definitely a good choice for this camera. So looking at this first image here, as we can see, it's got a nice colour to it. Nice uniform contrast. The exposure is good. It's an overcast day, but reasonably bright. It's a 400 ISO film, so you'd expect contrast and exposure to be reasonable. The sharpness is okay, especially in the foreground where the churchyard wall is, but it does tail off a little bit towards the further distance, so it's just lacking a little bit in critical focus towards the background there. So let's have a look what else we have here. So frame 8 here is a little reed bed in a local park quite close to where I live. Again, quite an evenly lit overcast day, so there's no spikes in the exposure, there's no excessively dark underexposed bits. But when you look carefully, the reeds themselves do seem to be a bit out of focus. Now I did have to open the aperture a bit, i.e. turn the ISO down to a lower number to compensate for the slightly overcast day. Had it been a brighter day, I could have used a smaller aperture or a higher ISO setting, and that would have improved with the depth of field. But we don't always get the options we want, so if it is overcast, if you are having to open the iris, just be aware that you need to make sure your subjects are, well, ideally 2.8 meters away, 2.8 meters and perhaps a little bit above, because that's where the optimal focus is on this lens. So the next frame is frame 9, just here, the church. An unremarkable image in reality, but I quite liked it as it's caught the two birds in the sky just to the left of the tower in flight, and that just shows that with that 125th of a second shutter speed, it's a well chosen speed. So if that was somebody, perhaps a child or a relative riding a bicycle in the garden, you would capture the rider in motion. Obviously it's not a sports camera, you're not going to be using this for any high-end sporting type activity, but it's a well chosen speed, avoids camera shake, freezes a certain amount of motion without being so fast that exposure becomes difficult. Moving on, let's jump to where are we? Yeah, number 13, lucky number 13, this guy here, which just goes to show at the right distance and in the right lighting, the sharpness can be quite acceptable, and that would have been taken at the 400 ISO setting on a sunny day. So you've got the maximum depth of field, and it is just about exactly at 2.8 meters, so that's pretty acceptable for sharpness, showing that you can get good results on these. And remember, these point and shoot cameras, they are for high days and holidays. They are intended for use on your summer holiday in Ibiza. This is absolutely the kind of party camera with the close-up flash setting, plus the focus optimized to that mid-distance. Ideal for beach shots, ideal for going clubbing with. It's just a fun little camera to take your high day and holiday pictures with. It's not really intended for serious photography. It's going to take a little bit of rough and tumble of operating with sunscreen on your hands and that sort of thing. So it's built for a purpose, and it does the job pretty well, given the right conditions. What else do we have here? So this frame here, good mid-distance sharpness. I've wanted to show you this picture just because there is the slight hint of flare starting to show in the right hand side, But Konica didn't put a cheap basic lens. It's a 4-element lens, which is unusual in a point-and-shoot fixed focus camera. It's a multi-coated lens, so flare's pretty well controlled even in this picture. But I just wanted to show that because it does start to creep in when the sun's, getting into frame a little bit. The next shot. So let's turn to this picture of the Churchyard. Worth noting, I don't know if you can see it on the negative, there is just a hint of a light leak here. You can see between the negatives and the spacing and up into the perforations, there is just a hint of a light leak, which I've only just noticed. But looking at the picture, we now start to see the limit of the pan focus lens. The aperture is open up as the door is recessed into the church. It's not in direct sun, probably f8. We're about 2 meters away, so a little bit closer than that sweet spot of 2.8 meters, and the softness is starting to be apparent. On the other hand, if it were a holiday snap from 1982, a casual snapper might be quite pleased, although I might suggest they choose a better holiday location if that were their holiday snap from 1982. I don't think the local churchyard is quite the place to be. Going on to this one of my favourite photos from the roll, actually. This guy here. And this really is more a test of the film than it is of anything else. So we've got a lot of variation in the exposure. We've got the overhanging tree, which is obviously in deep shadow. Then we've got the grass, or the mid distance, which is in sunlight, and then furthest from the camera is a field in direct sunlight, and it really shows the exposure latitude of colour negative film. Obviously the grass in full sunlight is blown out, but the fact it's retained exposure or detail throughout most of that frame is pretty handy. Going on from there, went to a little lock, just this frame here, and now we can see it's a reasonably bright day, but it was overcast. Using the 400 ISO setting, which is f16, it really shows how that lens is optimized for the near distance, with the lock gates being pretty sharp, but as you look towards the background and the trees in the distance, it starts to suffer a little bit. So going back to our flowers at the side of the road, this was an overcast day, so much so in fact that as I walked back to the car it started to rain. Again, we're quite close to the subject, and we're really seeing now the limitation of these fixed focus cameras, as we're having to shoot at 100 ISO or f8, and we're effectively too close to the subject. Again, if we could stop the lens down and get more depth of field, that would help. The other thing we can see here is vignetting quite clearly displayed in this image, and a lot of people will find that creative or interesting in a photograph, but in terms of lens design, it's something to be avoided. You don't want the corners getting darker compared to the middle if you can possibly avoid it. As good a lens as that 36mm f4 Hexanon is, it is a basic lens in a fixed focus camera, and you can't have everything all together. So the last frame I took on this camera was this cloud scene. It's not the last frame on the roll of film. As you can see, there's quite a lot of film left at the end of the roll, but I was keen to send it off and get it processed so I could share these images with you. Literally, I've just taken a couple of photographs down by that lock. I saw some nice clouds, pointed the camera up, pushed a button, and that's what I got. I think that's my favourite shot on the whole roll, to be perfectly honest. And that's really how Konica Pop's meant to be used, point and press. So that's it for the photographs. I just want to point out a couple of little discrepancies. We can see here there's a very narrow gap between the frames, and here a much wider gap and then a medium gap. So the film transport I mean, bearing in mind this camera is at least 36 years old, it's not quite working perfectly. There's only one little fleck of light leak, which we noticed earlier, but the negative spacings are a little bit erratic, so it's clearly not winding on quite right. And if you get a Konica Pop, you want to make sure that it is winding on correctly and it's not leaking light before you use it for anything important. So let's go back to the view of the camera, and we'll wrap this up. So there we have it. That's the Konica Pop, an absolute classic icon from the 1980s. To my mind, you know, when you can take this out of your drawer, having not used it for years, it just seems to me to be saying, come on, get your glad rags on, let's go down the Hacienda, let's go to Ibiza. It's a camera you don't mind taking to those sorts of places, and you know, getting sticky sugary drinks thrown all over it, which may or may not be alcoholic, of course. It's just that kind of fun party camera. An ideal second camera if you've got a posh camera that you don't want to destroy on the beach in Ibiza, or indeed in the club. This might well be the way to go. Certainly I have known one or two people take these to places like the Amazon when they've been doing Operation Raleigh, obviously back in the 80s and 90s, and they've always seemed to carried on working where many electronic cameras would have packed up. The camera, when it was new, was £50, and that was quite a lot for a fixed focus, fixed exposure camera. You could buy what was ostensibly the same specification, certainly for 30. So £50 was quite a lot of money to ask for it. To get a camera that had actual autofocus and DX coding and auto exposure at this time would have been, you know, £70 plus. And the posh ones like the Canon SureShot or the Nikon AF3 or the Minolta AFS for that matter, they would have been more in the £100 to £150 range, depending which model. There were at the time some, let's say, second or third tier branded cameras which sold for £50 and claimed to offer autofocus exposure and so forth. They were mostly sold through, let's say, CE, consumer electronic chain stores. And if you're in a store and somebody said to you, you can have this camera for £50 and it doesn't do anything. It's fixed focus, fixed exposure, manual winding, but it's a great little camera, you might well turn around and say, well, I've just been to that consumer electronics chain store around the corner and seen a camera for £50 that does have those features. So it was a little bit of a hard sell at times. The problem with those cameras I've referred to, they were horribly unreliable. So it might be perhaps a Pyrrhic victory, but 36 years later, my little Konica Pop is still going strong. When you bought it, it came with a case with a lens cap and a bit of string to stop you losing it. That didn't always work, apparently. A roll of Konica Color film and a couple of batteries, and it came in a very nice little presentation case. Should you buy one today? Well, as you can probably tell, I think it's a great camera, and I would suggest that everybody at some point should run a roll of film through a Konica Pop. Should you buy one, sorry, just fiddling with the focus. Should you buy one, I have seen them recently fetching quite silly amounts of money, like £70, and I think that's too much. But I had a look on eBay this morning, and I did see some going for £20 and £30, and I wouldn't recommend it as your only camera. But if you like cameras, you want to have a bit of a collection of analog or film cameras, then yeah, absolutely, everyone should run a roll of film through a Konica Pop, as I've said. And they are quite pretty. Some people, they try and collect all the colours, and I'm waffling on because I was trying to remember what it was I'd forgotten. So when it first came out, you could buy it in Very vibrant colours like black or white. There was also blue and red, and I think the yellow was a colour available with the original 82 versions, the ones that have hexagon printed on the lens. And then in 85 they came out in green, which they called mint green, khaki, yellow, and silver and pink. I think that was all the colours they came in. The last revision I mentioned earlier in 88 included a date back, which would print the date or time on your photographs. Interestingly, that only goes up to 2019 if you see one. And that's fairly common with date printing backs. It's almost as if they felt there was going to be nothing worth photographing in 2020. And there we go. Anyway, that's been the Konica Pop. I hope somebody's found this video useful or interesting. Thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it, and do have a good day.